You either live by the gun or you die by the sword.
Welcome to The Good, the Bad, and the Weird. I'm Nico.
And I'm Chris.
And Chris, ancient alien theorists believe that either aliens came to this Earth to breed with us, make us one with them, or murder us.
Or make pyramids for their landing sites.
But they can't make up their minds on anything, and that's
No.
why Ancient Aliens is bullshit.
No, that's why the History Channel is now, sadly, bullshit.
Yes, we're back to aliens. I'm excited. It's that time of year.
Happy America Day, everyone.
America. Well, this will come out the day after America Day.
Yeah, happy post-America Day, where in the Midwest, it's still America Day. There will still be fireworks and gunshots.
Yeah, I'm surprised I haven't heard too many around here just yet.
You haven't lived downtown. I have heard many.
Oh, true.
There's a lot of people stuck in their homes and their driveways right now who have bought plenty of sparkler.
Putting that stimulus check to work.
Definitely. All right. So this year, we wanted to cover a slightly different type of alien film.
Yes, not so much bangs and booms.
And also something that teeters on the fear that alien movies always have in them, but has a nice little spin to it. A nice little different point of view of aliens. So, Arrival.
Arrival. Now, I had wanted to see this movie when it came out in theaters, but for some reason, I think I was just busy and just moved here and didn't know where stuff really was. And so I just didn't go see it. And wait, no, okay, I was getting ready to move here. That's right. That's why I didn't go see it.
Yeah.
But I wanted to see this movie. Just it evaded me, and
It evaded a lot of people.
And honestly, for me, after watching it for the first time, it's probably one of the best alien movies I've seen.
Yeah, it is. Somehow I watched this movie, which, for you not watching this movie, it happens, that sucks, but, I'm also surprised you didn't get around to it. Me watching this movie, I thought about it, because my mom was interested in this movie, and I was like, Mom, you would love this movie. Wait, why did I go see this movie?
Yeah.
Because I did. I went and saw this movie when it came out. I have no idea why. I'm not particularly fond of good alien movies.
Yeah.
All of the alien movies that I love were from the 70s, or, have a real campy vibe to them. This one has no campiness to it whatsoever. I'm also not, super into any of the main actors or the main actress. I'm not crazy into linguistics. I have no clue why I went to see this movie in theaters.
And even then, I think that's what made this movie so overshadowed, I'd say. Because I know people who went and saw it, and they liked it, but they didn't know how to feel about it, because it's not your standard first contact movie. Because it's not an invasion movie, it's a contact movie.
The other thing that I think, this is one of those things that doesn't normally happen with films, but I think this movie, really the best way to digest it is at home. Because there's a lot of unsaid dialogue that you could really take to heart, especially nowadays, in our current world environment, that you could feel like this movie's directly trying to address.
Another part where we didn't plan stuff, and it's slightly poignant to what's going on.
Yeah. Oh, no. We're halfway through the year.
Yeah. Oh, shit. Yeah, that's right.
I recently reread all of the events that happened, and it was 3 pages, and they were just in February. This year's going real slow.
Yeah.
Real quickly, real slow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Treadmill's on high, but we're not going anywhere.
Yeah. So, anywho, Arrival is actually based off a short story by Ted Chiang.
I read that as Ching, but I do not know. I am kind of bummed that I didn't know that. I would have really liked to have read the book, but I definitely ran out of time, and my library currently does not have it.
Yeah. And it's a short story, and it's called Story of Your Life, so that's why you might not be able to find it so easily.
Yeah.
But there was a quote he said in the special features of the movie that really puts a perspective and an overtone for the entire film. And what he said is, to me, science fiction is not about special effects or giant battles between the forces of good and evil. Science fiction is about using speculative scenarios as a lens to understand the human condition.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that this movie does really well, is if you're into reading the science fiction world in, like, the general novels and books, that's more of the theme of most of those stories, which is why a lot of us love that genre. And then when you move to the movie world of science fiction, you get a lot of sci-fi TV show sort of movies.
Yeah.
Where, yeah, they're great, don't get me wrong, I love them, and they are very entertaining, but you lose a lot of the thought-provoking points.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing between good sci-fi movies and just kind of like whatever movies.
Yeah.
Because I've been watching a bunch of sci-fi movies. It's been hard to find like good sci-fi horror outside of stuff I've seen like Event Horizon.
Sure.
But like I remember I wanted to see a movie years ago called Battle Los Angeles.
Oh yeah.
And I watched it and I'm sitting there, I'm like, this is kind of shit, because like it starts off with action and then immediately dies down to, well, here's hours before the scene you just saw, and then it's just like non-stop. There's no reprieve. It's just you have an invasion, and it's not like Independence Day where there's like that build up to like, okay, we've seen them before. Like there's more to Independence Day than that one.
I think a lot of times for the sci-fi film problems, we have a huge problem with its sci-fi action. So, which, don't get me wrong, again, it has its place, but there's definitely not enough pure sci-fi films out there.
Yeah.
And especially not enough good ones. Because, dialogue can be boring. And Arrival did dialogue really nicely.
Yeah, okay, so there's actually quite a bit to this. So, Chiang didn't want to, or he didn't never imagine the story becoming a movie.
Yeah, especially since it's a short story.
Well, even then, I mean, Children of the Corn was a short story too.
It was also a short movie, though.
This is over 2 hours. But the producers came to him and they're like, "Hey, we really want to do this." And he's like, "Okay, if you can find the right director."
Yeah.
And so, he was sent a film by this man who's kind of an up-and-comer. I've actually talked to Parker in our mechanical department about this, and this guy keeps being brought up. Denis Villeneuve. It's French.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll butcher it. Don't know any French.
I can say baguette.
I can say that too. But his films have been coming up because I've had conversations with Parker about what's going to be like who's going to be the next Stanley Kubrick. And
the up and comings.
Yeah, he kept bringing Villeneuve up, and for me it was just like, okay, I'll maybe check them out. But they sent him a film called Incendies.
I don't know that one.
It's one of his earlier films, but Chiang said that if they had sent him just a generic sci-fi movie, he would have said straight out no to them. But because they sent him a movie that they felt would be a good tone for Arrival,
ooh, smart play.
Yeah, and so he's like, that's what they had to do. Well, on top of that, Villeneuve wanted to do a sci-fi movie, and he hadn't done anything before. He's also done, the other one I can think of off the top of my head is Sicario.
Yes.
Which I still haven't seen yet, but I've heard it's fantastic. But at the time he was shooting a movie called Prisoners, and he didn't have time, and he personally didn't know how to adapt the story.
Yeah. And
so, down the line, the producers got this writer, Eric Heiserer.
Yeah.
To write the story, and then they sent it to Villeneuve, and he like, oh, you cracked it. This is the way to do the movie.
Yeah.
And like, here you expanded upon it and you made it
a full thing.
Yeah, a full thing. And so that's when he was on board to do it. It's interesting too because Villeneuve went on to do Blade Runner 2049.
Which, you know.
Is it? I know a lot of people hated it when it first came out, but for me, it was about the time I really stopped watching trailers and keeping up to date with, the new trailer's out. Mm-hmm. Because the trailer made Blade Runner 2049 out to be like it was going to be this big action movie.
Yeah, it wasn't a good representation trailer.
Exactly. And so I went and saw that in theaters, and I loved it because it wasn't that action movie.
Yeah, and I think that one's another one that's going to have, once people have been like, oh yeah, I didn't get around to seeing that, and I'm going to see that now.
Yep.
I think it's going to hit its drive.
And Villeneuve is on to direct Dune.
Ah, yes.
Which I still have to read. But... a little bit more of the backstory. The writer Chiang also he wanted to write about something that's skipped in a lot of the sci-fi movies and just movies in general, and it was about learning language and learning to communicate, learning to communicate something foreign. And the movie deals a lot with this hypothesis that is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Yep.
And it deals with learning, like, people's understanding of language is kind of set from their first language.
Yeah.
And someone who's going through trying to learn 2 other languages currently, you come across, okay, well, this is how they interpret it. Like, in German, they like to take 2 words and kind of just jam them together. Mm-hmm. Like my personal favorite, Haustier. Mm-hmm. We would translate that to pet, but its literal translation is house animal.
I mean, yeah, if it goes in your house, is animal. House animal.
Yep. And I was listening to some professors talk about it a little bit earlier today. And they were talking about how in Russia, they have 2 separate words for light blue and dark blue.
Oh, and so that would be handy.
Yeah, they categorize it. There was one TED Talk. I didn't write her name down, but she was talking with these Aboriginals and how they don't have a left and right. It's all off of cardinal direction.
I'd be okay with that.
Yeah.
That would be fine.
And so how they understood time also changed as well, because you face them in a different direction. And time is still following the same way because it's all based off the sun.
I mean, that makes sense, though, because, like, if you didn't know about the fancy world clock that we all run off of, you would have to figure out a different way to know about that.
Yeah. I looked it up. It is Lyra Boroditsky. It's a short 14-minute video. If you have a chance, I highly recommend it. It's fascinating. It's something interesting to think about because we really don't think about it.
Yeah, no, it is true, especially if you're only, learning another language just kind of for fun. You're not really involving yourself in the other culture. Mm-hmm. It's really easy to forget that, it's not a direct translation for everything.
Yeah.
Like there's completely different meanings behind certain words.
Yeah.
There's just no real way to pinpoint.
It's like I had a Japanese professor in college, Rumiko Honda, and she started off, because she taught our architectural theory class, and she started off with the semester saying, I won't tell you jokes, you won't tell me, you shouldn't tell me jokes. Our humors are different. We don't understand I don't understand American humor, and you won't understand Japanese humor, so.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of people, especially nowadays, are learning that, like, there are different humors in the world, and, like, not just that, but there's different ways of doing everything.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's just, learning what niche you do enjoy, and, like, involving yourself in it. Like, if you're really into British humor, watch all the British humor.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you don't like British humor, now you kind of have an understanding why. And on top of that, Arrival didn't just tackle it theoretically with how to do this language barrier. They got actual linguists involved in this, which is part of the reason why, especially the first part of the movie, feels so convincing.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's the thing too, because I talked to my parents about it a little bit, just because I was curious, and I sent our group of friends a group message about where did they learn language.
Yeah, which was an interesting question, because, like, I knew where you were coming from with this question.
Yeah.
But especially for, like, American kids, there's really not a good, like, starting point for a lot of us. A lot of it's like, well, it just kind of was always there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I talked to my mom about it because I was curious about it too, because my dad's mother's German. And so I unfortunately didn't get a chance to call her. Life got busy over the weekend and just didn't get a chance. And also, I felt the conversation would have been something better in person to ask her.
Yeah.
Because she moved to the United States right after World War II, where there was a lot of hatred towards German people.
Yeah. And also, there's a lot that would be missed just over the phone for that conversation.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Like, visual... That's the other thing, too. The visual ties and everything. But we also realized that's kind of why my dad pronounces some words differently, because he was taught by a German woman how to speak English.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those things where, like, it's going to vary greatly on, like, what your relationship with language is. And I think Arrival does nicely try to not just show it, which a lot of films do, but it fully tries to explain it to people. Like, she has the example of where the word kangaroo comes from, and she tells the whole story about the fake story about how the word kangaroo came to be. And while the story is fake, it literally lays out for the audience what we're dealing with here. Yeah. Because it is an issue that, especially if you only really speak one language and, like, maybe you took some classes in high school to graduate, it's not... The language barrier doesn't seem like that big of a deal. And so for them to not just break it down with that story, but then for her to break down a whole sentence, which would be a standard question that most alien films are asking, why are you here and should I shoot you? You know, that them breaking that down, even if there's some errors, you know, way down the logic line, it really helps the audience fully grasp why and what is going on. Oh, yeah. And me personally, in my experiences, I took German in middle school and high school for 1 year, and then I moved to Italy and took Italian. But in German, the sentence structure for a question is different, which is a great example, because that's the first thing she breaks down is the question. Yeah, like, do they understand a question? And then, like, I liked how she also... and part of the writing in general was they were approaching this from, they're not even sure that the aliens are capable of single thought. Like, they truly do not know anything about this organism, and it was nice for them to address it as, like, we truly don't know anything. We could be, for all we know, talking to an ant. Yeah. And instead of the more general alien trope, which is, you know, we know they're all individuals and that, you know, maybe they have a collective mind thought process, but there's a direct communication ability there. Yeah, because that's another thing they established. So we're almost 20 minutes in. We haven't even talked about the basics of the plot. So for those of you who haven't seen it, and if you haven't, stop right now, go watch it, because there's going to be a lot to talk about for this movie. And unfortunately, there is no way to not spoil this one. No. Sorry. So it's really about this linguist who's asked by the U.S. government to come and translate an alien. In our first encounter with them, and that's a great thing about it too, how the movie starts off. It's just like a mundane, boring day. And on top of that, we don't really see the aliens until, I think I wrote it down as like 20 minutes into the movie. It takes a long... We see their ship more than the aliens. No, we see the ship 20 minutes into the movie. And what they do is they're allowing you to see the events happening through Amy Adams' character's mind. Or how she's encountering it. Of course, she saw it on the news, but like you only see like a split second of it on the news, and you only see like a dark screen for the most part. Yeah. They did a good job too of making this emergency state feel like a true emergency state. Like things are canceled, everyone go home, stay in your house, panic is starting, and then unfortunately there's a lot going on in the background of this film that feels very real as to our current situation, but it is a detail in there that makes this unlike a lot of other alien films where the news isn't them, like, they show the same couple clips of the ship, the one ship that they have, then they show maps they showed diagrams, and in the background, instead of continually focusing on that one, they move on to topics like, oh, now there's raiding and panic buying, and all the stores are out of this, lines for gas are getting this long, and it's never the focus of the screen, it's just playing in the background.
Yeah.
And I think when Arrival came out, that didn't hit home for a lot of people as it does now.
Yeah.
Now, there is not a single person who can watch this and not really jive and understand what that news segment is trying to say.
Well, in one of the special features, Villeneuve said that he feels society is more fragile than ever now.
Yeah.
And honestly, we did start to see ripples of this about 4 years ago.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that the film, from the beginning, goes ahead and answers a lot of its own questions. Like, in the beginning, we are shown a map of where all of the ships are, and there's a question put in the back of your head of why the locations that the ships pick.
That's actually about halfway through the movie. Yeah. So that's not at the beginning. At the very beginning, we're shown this story of a young girl being born.
There's a lot of weird flashing bits that don't make a whole lot of sense until the end.
Which, I've got some stuff on that later, because I watched the movie without taking notes, watched all the special features, and then went back and rewatched the movie. And then there was one point, I've been wanting to talk about this to you for like 3 weeks now.
Yep.
But I'll get to it later on in the episode. But I just had this aha moment of like, oh, this is something cool to keep an eye on in the movie. But yeah, I actually, I paused the movie and called my mom because I had to talk to someone about it. But yeah, I don't know, it's this weirdly, and that's the great thing about, how they talk about sci-fi is that it needs, and even horror films or movies in general. And I've been thinking about that too, because we've talked about trying to do like maybe a romance movie at some point.
Yeah.
But it has to be something that's applicable.
Yeah.
And something that is not necessarily relevant to that time, but actually tackles some kind of issue, or something like Marriage Story was a movie about divorce.
Yeah. We weren't interested in tackling a cute, feel-good fluff movie.
Yeah, exactly. Because what do you talk about?
Other than how fluffy it is, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the same thing with good sci-fi, is it has to be something better. I mean, there's a place for fluff films, sure, but most of those fluff films are kind of garbage.
Yeah, and like, don't get us wrong. Most of the films I watch are fluff of some genre, whether that be sci-fi or fantasy or horror or romance, you name it. Kung Fu. There's a lot of fluff Kung Fu that I watch, but they're not usually the films that I then want to sit down and think about or even talk with my friends about. Half the time they're not even ones that I'm like, oh, you haven't seen that? Oh my gosh, we need to watch it now.
Yeah.
It's, hey, you bored? We'll put on, White Tiger. Let's go.
Yeah. But yeah, anyway, back to the movie. So, the first time we actually see or have any type of contact with the entities, I'll call
the hextapods?
Heptapods. 7 pod.
Yes.
Foot. Heptapod.
I don't like that they call them feet, because those are clearly large fingers.
Yeah, kind of.
Those are just extra fingers on a hand that has been chopped off at the wrist.
Yeah. So our first contact with them is when Forrest Whitaker's character comes in and plays her an audio recording of the language.
Yes. A very nicely done audio clip. And we've talked about this before with Godzilla. Doing non-real creatures' sounds can be very difficult to do convincingly.
And they actually worked on that really hard. There's a lot that went into Heptapods. I want to talk about them a little bit later.
Yeah, because they are one of the more interesting alien designs in general.
So, and Amy Adams' character, I can't think of the name off the top of my head.
Sarah something? I don't remember. I just call her Amy throughout the whole movie.
Yeah. So she breaks down like that she can't translate it because, one, it's an unknown language.
Yep.
She doesn't have any way for...
She has no baseline for
no visual cues. Because she's been brought in by the military before to talk about or to translate Arabic. And she's like, well, I know the language. That's why I can translate it. She's like, this is...
Like, the army was confused why she didn't automatically know this alien language.
Yeah. Or could pick out a little something of it.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that this movie talks about, too, is, like, there's, like, the visual language of the heptapods, too. Yeah. Because once she gets to the ship, they're sitting there and, well, they can't translate. Like, there's
nothing to go off of.
Yeah, there's nothing to go off of. And then she, I can't remember. Yeah, the first time she goes in, she brings a whiteboard. Yeah. And, I mean, if you think about it, that's how we were taught, too. Like, that's the brilliancy of this movie is they're dumbing down a super complex topic just enough where, like, okay, we understand what's going on. And then we see the visual language of the heptapods, which there's nothing that we know of that's similar to it. Yeah. And they worked really hard to create that language too. But
and honestly, from what I read with interviews with other linguists who weren't involved in this film, the whole concept seemed to be, from their point of view, more or less really well done. Like the way they attempt, especially the first part. Once we get to upping the pace a little bit because of outside issues, I think more people had questions on how we were progressing so quickly. But the written language was something that all of them said, yeah, no, this isn't currently possible. And that with sci-fi is like that little nugget that you need for it to feel like a proper sci-fi film. Because like, oh, it's written in a circle, in theory sounds okay. Yeah, it's just weird. Yeah. And then once you start, because they're breaking it down not just so that you have a basic understanding, they're breaking it down so that you also are slowly becoming an expert throughout the whole movie. So by the time you get to the end and she's explaining, like, well, now you're thinking in their language, the entireness of their writing, suddenly you're like, oh no, this is not possible. Yeah. Not even like, oh, it's in a cute circle. Like, no.
Yeah, and I don't know, it's something interesting to think about too, because and I've been thinking about it quite a bit, just because our profession, as architectural designers, they talk about a language that doesn't have a direct verbal translation. Yeah. And in college, I had a professor who brought up the question, if we had no concept of a language, how would we translate an arrow? Like, what social context, like, you have to have a social context to understand it. And even then, like, architecturally, when we start breaking down the fanciness of it, we get down to what we do, and we don't make buildings. We make representations of buildings. Exactly, yeah. And even then, like, if you don't have any annotations or anything on your drawings, that a wall section in itself is a language of its own. Oh yeah, no. Like, I think every designer has had a professor who attempted to convince you at some point that, like, drawing is the language that has no barriers, sort of thing. Which, yes and no. Like, there's obviously barriers. Like, if you show my grandmother a wall section, she will not know what that is. And even if you're like, it's part of the wall, that still would be a complete, like, there is no way for her to wrap her mind around it because she doesn't think spatially. Yeah. Like, she was never taught to. And that goes back down to the language of things and learning the language. So in a way, we have a second language, but we have to translate it through English language, which doesn't always translate well, because I know when I've talked with my brothers and my parents about architecture, like,
that's always a fun conversation.
Yeah, you can bring up something and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? It's like, oh, I understand. You don't know what an exploded axonometric is and why this drawing is so cool for what it's doing.
Yeah, or like this diagram here, which is a nonverbal diagram showing, the R rating of this wall. This is a beautiful diagram, and they go, but what does it mean? Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you have to go, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the great thing about Arrival, is that it breaks down that communication so simplistically. And it covers it, but it also glosses over a huge section of it.
It does, but it does so in a way that makes it feel really nice, because part of the section they gloss over, but they also they throw enough pebbles in the water for you to go, oh, they did think about this.
Mm-hmm.
We're just not talking about it. Is, English isn't the only spoken language. And as we've already said, English arguably is not even somewhat close to a lot of other languages.
English is a bastard stepchild of multiple languages.
Which arguably would make it very difficult from a translation standpoint.
Yeah.
And on top of that, in the movie, English is not the only language attempting to translate.
Yeah. Well, and a little other side story. My mom did some teaching English to foreign people wanting to learn English in the States. And she was trying to teach them the word tat.
Ooh, that's a hard word.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so she had some on the shirt she was wearing, and she's like, tat. And it was kind of near her chest, and they're like, oh, boobs!
Like, no.
No, there's a word close, but yeah.
Well, and a lot of people run into similar problems with, even if you are an English speaker.
English springer.
At this point, aren't we all? But even if you are an English speaker, because there are words within our own language that are not consistent across the board.
Yeah.
And not just in the cute, oh, this word sounds like this word, or you could use these two interchangeably, but this word over here in the East Coast, maybe it's a slang word, maybe it's just an item word.
Yeah.
Is this, and then over here, either they have a completely different word for it, a different saying for it. Arguably, there's so many different variations within it.
I mean, I've experienced that multiple times too. Every time I've moved back to the States from living overseas, some new phrase or...
There's always a new phrase.
Something's come up,
To sound like an old person, all you young folk keep making up new words.
I hate the word woke.
I love it, but I also really enjoy, adding very unironically, youth culture language into my own, so that I sound like that cool aunt.
You're gonna be Steve Buscemi in that high school.
I will. No, that is.
What's up, my fellow students?
What up, my cool dudes, fellow youths? Yes.
But yeah. Anywho.
And I don't know. This is one of the topics that this film does try to address, even if they are not addressing it directly.
Yeah.
Which is nice because, again, this is one of those points that grounds a sci-fi film in enough reality for you to feel like it's got something decent to say,
something believable about it. And so, I mean, that's really the whole thing about the movie is we're learning about the language, and we're also learning that the world's kind of breaking down about this because we're not getting through. But at the same point, everyone is getting through at a slightly different pace. And in a different way, too. Because we find out later on that the Chinese are teaching through Mahjong.
Which is kind of like chess.
Yeah. No. Is it Mahjong?
I think they
were... I thought Mahjong's the tile game.
Yeah, it is, but the strategy behind it. It's a strategy win or lose game.
Okay. Yeah. I know nothing about board games for the most part, so...
It's not a board game in which there are... it's not Candyland.
Okay.
Where it's everyone had a good time. It's kind of like how in chess, where it's seen as you're the victor and you're the loser.
Yeah,
each move is specific.
Okay,
There's no, chance element.
They bring that up because there's a winner and loser instead of just trying to communicate. Just do basic communication.
Yeah, and it's... I like the little nuggets that they put in because, it seems that everyone is learning at about the same rate.
Yeah.
But in the movie, but everyone is getting something different out of it, and part of that is whoever's looking at its point of view.
Yeah.
Even within the American military base that we are physically getting to see and experience most of.
Well, and that ties all back to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, where how you view the world is going to change how you communicate.
Yeah, exactly. So, the Chinese were trying to talk using a game because they thought, well, this is a nonverbal communication, but they already had a question in mind. Are you here to hurt us?
Yeah.
And so instead of having alternative options...
Instead of building a vocabulary off the bat, you're trying to get questions done. She explains, you can't ask a question without understanding their thought process.
Yeah, or even... They weren't even and not just China, but it was also mentioned, I think, that, like, Russia and, I don't remember the other country, but there was another country that was also, not with board games, but also coming up with similar answers of, like, no, they are not friendly.
Yeah.
Was kind of their deciding factor. And one of the things that we saw repeated, and you could even argue that, you know, the American base was doing something similar, was there was never, with the exception of, like, the scientists who are not militarized, the question was never, what if they are just acting? This isn't communication to them. So, like, with the exception of the scientists who were asking that question, none of the world governments were asking that question. Yeah. And so they were already primed for a yes or no answer.
Yeah. And, I mean, that's a very difficult thing because, as we know, some words don't as we find out.
Yeah, as we find out later, some words don't translate well.
Yeah.
And even words that don't translate well, when they are trying to explain that to their uppers, the word that doesn't translate well is weapon.
Yeah.
They come up with the word weapon, and the scientists are trying to explain, well, A, this could be our error. We don't know that they actually said that. We don't know if they know what that word means. And maybe we are mistranslating.
Well, it's also a nice tie to the beginning because when she's talking to, what's his name? Jeremy Renner.
Hawkeye. His name is now Hawkeye.
When she's talking to Jeremy Renner, she brings up that language is the first weapon to be used.
Yeah. And
it's very true because, I mean, I'm going to get a little bit political on this because it's kind of current. What you see happening is someone will say something and then they'll immediately start attacking them with words.
Yes.
Describing the actions they do, the actions they'll take if they're brought into power. And
especially because this movie is you're supposed to be trying to look at it through a non-biased scientific lens, but that lens is being clouded by a military lens on top of that.
Exactly.
And in this movie, it's a very polarized and on-edge military lens. And so, yeah, you're constantly under, even as an audience member who has no say in this game, you feel a constant sense of edge and urgency.
Yeah.
To something that the scientists clearly are trying to make them understand that, like, we cannot rush this.
Yeah. Well,
we can only go so fast.
Well, I also have kind of a odd question that I just thought of. The heptapods.
Yes.
Are they doing the same thing? Are they trying? Because we know they came down with a purpose.
Yes.
But at the same time, they're also participating in the communication. Like, are they on a time limit as well, or? Well,
you kind of get a sense that, yes, they are on a time limit, but not the same. We're given the hint that they are not on the same time limit that we are. Because one of the heptapods is shown being in the death cycle.
Yes.
And so it's implied then, at least how I interpret it, was maybe it took them so long to get here that we're talking to the equivalent of, like, 95-year-old people.
Well, he's in the death cycles because of the explosion.
Oh, so because of the explosion.
It's outside of his natural life. But
at the same time, like, we have to assume that, like, they can't be here permanently. Like, yeah, their ship is really cool, and it's not explained at all, like, what the limitations of the ship are.
Yeah, so...
But at the same time, it's expected, especially with a preface to science fiction films, that, yeah, they can't be here indefinitely. Yeah,
and... Well, yes and no, because, like, if you look at other series, like the manga series, Gintama.
Oh, sure.
The aliens are here to stay.
They are here permanently, but I would argue that all of the ones that attempt to have the aliens stay permanently require a level of either domination, because they need to inhabit the Earth, or some level of reliance on the people. I'm thinking like Alien versus Predator style, where there's a reliance upon the human portion.
Yeah.
And as far as we watch in this movie, while the aliens are clearly here, they are clearly here for us and to talk with us as best as we can tell.
Yeah.
They are not actively pursuing the living organism Earth. Like, it's even to the point where their ship doesn't leave a footprint.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you do make a good point there. Yeah, it's not like Star Trek where
they're
symbiotically working together, but
It very much feels like, from a writer's standpoint, if I was attempting to explain this, like if I had written this, my thought process would probably be, well, they are also some form of scientists.
Yeah.
You don't send warriors to space on long space ships. You send astronauts.
Yeah.
You send scientists. And so they are also scientists. And sure, maybe they have a militarized goal, but they are going to take every opportunity to be scientists.
Because that's the thing they say, too, is that they break up that they're going to need our help in 15,000 years.
3,000 years.
3,000 years. Some astronomical...
A long time.
A long time where all the characters in the story don't matter anymore.
Yeah. In the faraway future, which theoretically doesn't matter, but does. It does matter. It's still the future. Well,
and that there's so much science to this movie, too. I can't remember, but the Ching is also a scientist as well, or a doctor.
Fancy.
It said what degrees he was in or what his profession actually was outside of being a writer.
Gotcha.
In the special features, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
Computer science? Maybe? Not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. They mentioned something in the special features, but they're also talking about, and this is going to be a big point where we spoil everything. Throughout the movie, we're shown snippets of Amy Adams' character and a little girl.
Yeah.
Through her life, her death, we know that she dies young, and it's a little bit of a mislead on the way it's presented to us until the very end that this took place in the past.
Yeah, it very much feels like a memory through the whole movie.
Very much so, until the very, very end, when we find out that when you learn the language, you see time completely differently, and all these events that we have assumed are flashbacks are future visions.
Yeah.
I have other stuff to talk about that. But that was another big theme about the movie was how there's a theory that I can't remember the actual name of what happens, but it's the death of the universe where everything stops. There's a theory that everything is happening in a sequential order. It's not as random as we think. And so by knowing the future doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to change it. I mean, we see it in Greek and Shakespeare's stories.
The idea of fate has always been prevalent.
Yeah, and it's this theory that we started from something and it's going to end the way it ends. Like it's
like there's no changing your fate.
Yeah, I've dumbed it, and they have a way to explain it scientifically, and I've dumbed it down to my level of understanding.
Well, and to be fair though, most movies, especially most modern movies, have taken the dumbed down concept of fate. And I would argue that most modern movies have taken the concept of fate and attempted to show it in a way that you can change. Yeah. That's kind of been the current trope, but that hasn't always been the case. A lot of older, not only movies, but, old storytelling, fate was something that you needed to prepare yourself for, but you weren't going to be changed.
You are the chosen hero kind of thing.
Yeah. I would argue that anime fate is still a very standard trope.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you, there's a couple movies. Have you seen Source Code or Mr. Nobody?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, Source Code's not a good example. Mr. Nobody's a pretty good one. I would highly recommend it. It's a 3-hour movie, but it is damn good. Jared Leto's in it, and he plays a man who is on his deathbed, and he's the last mortal in a world of immortals.
Ooh.
And he's recounting his life. And in a way, it kind of relates to this movie because this movie has a very non-linear storyline. Kind of want to talk about my aha moment at this point.
Yes.
And why, and I don't know, there's questions I have about this movie that I've had 3 weeks to think about this, and I still don't have answers for.
That is one of the joys of this movie, though.
Yeah, I mean, this is a movie to go back and rewatch from time to time to try and figure stuff out. Because when I was rewatching it the second time, outside of the very beginning, when she says, I used to think that this was the start of your story, but now I'm not so sure anymore.
Yeah.
Well, as we progress, we see nothing about the flashbacks until we start learning the language.
Yes.
And then they get heavier and heavier the more she understands. And that was my big aha moment of like, because I was going back and I'm like, okay, I know this is a nonlinear story now. What order are we seeing the daughter's life in? And that was my initial thought. And then I got to that point and it's like, oh, the reason she's seeing these visions, she doesn't even understand them, but it's because she's starting to have that concept and that cognitive thought of like understanding people's culture or their society. Like, what was it? Well, in our society now, we know a lot about Japanese culture more so than ever before.
I would say it's becoming a very popular subject of study.
Yeah. Well, I watched a propaganda film called Know Your Enemy, Japan.
I've also run across this film.
It's something interesting to go back and watch these old propaganda films because they're like, oh, this is what the enemy does. And now we know that we're like, no.
Yeah. I will say that, especially that propaganda film, is a very interesting snip of history. Mm-hmm. And granted, it was meant to be over the top and fear-inducing. Yeah. But at the same time, it is still a snippet of how someone thought, which influenced how a lot of people thought.
It's thoughts that are built off of ignorance and fear, which is reflected in this movie.
Yeah. And something else that I like how this film does with the idea of nonlinear time is instead of having the time jumps that we see be time jumps, or they're presented as memories as opposed to being visions of the future.
I'll counter that. They're presented as dreams initially.
Yes, they are.
Because they're always happening when she falls asleep. And Hawkeye's character says...
Hawkeye.
Yeah, Hawkeye.
I'm sorry, Jeremy Renner, but you are now just Hawkeye.
He says, are you dreaming in their language? And that's a big moment for a lot of people when they're learning.
Well, hi, Charlie. Oh, my.
When they're learning another language, when they really start to learn the language, sometimes they'll start to dream in that language a little bit.
Life goals.
Yeah. I mean,
and not this doesn't happen to everyone. I grew up with a friend who, bless his dad's sweet, sweet soul, never truly got English super well. Like, he lived here for over 30 years by the time I knew him, but you could see him physically translating every word that came out of his mouth.
Yeah. I've been listening to Joe Rogan's podcast a lot recently, and he had Jimmy O Yang on it, and he was talking
he's
about...
an interesting guy.
He is, and he was talking about how his dad still doesn't fully understand English sometimes.
Like, there's always parts that never quite make it.
Yeah, and so he just says, oh, yes, okay.
My friend's dad, like, you could physically see him trying to, like, we always called it reloading, like, because he'd be starting a sentence and then just, as he was, like, processing the best word to pick.
Well,
but I like Arrival's version of it because this language is presented in not just we're learning how to communicate, which a lot of alien films, at some point, either it's already established or they attempt to speak and communicate with.
Well,
this one, they are attempting to not just learn the language, but integrate into their way of thinking.
Yeah, well, we also do, like, for example, a movie like Alien. We're established through nonverbal language.
It is made very clear that they are here to kill you.
Not only that, but just in the design of the creature itself is what makes it hostile. Because we know there's something in our primitive brain that says, oh, something's baring its teeth. That's a sign of aggression.
Yeah, and Arrival, I think, did a really nice design job addressing that. And Alien's a great example. The architecture that's in almost all the Alien films is something that feels primitive. It feels dangerous even after or before it was a ruin. The carvings that they do bother to zoom in on the wall always they're not happy.
No.
You never get sunshine and flowers out of them. Whereas with Arrival, the ship is scary because it's unknown and foreign, but the room that we go into inside the ship, from a design standpoint, is arguably a clean and safe environment. Like, there's nothing in the room other than the scary wall to elicit a fear.
So, fun fact, all of that is set. Which
it's
hella
great
cool.
Set.
It's such a primitive design too. And this is actually a good point to go into the design of the alien and the ship and everything.
Oh, I love the design of the ship.
I have a great. There's a lot of stuff I like with this.
Yes, same. This is arguably one of my favorite alien designs.
So, Villeneuve, I'm gonna butcher it still. Thought the ship should be different, and that he just had this idea of a pebble being ominous. And on top of that, the ship's not built with some high-tech metal. It's very stone. It's monolithic.
It's monolithic, and on top of that, there's no part of it that seems recognizable.
Yeah, that we can understand. It's completely alien to us.
Yeah, there's no burners, there's no gun bit, there's no window bit even.
Yeah, like you mentioned, it just it doesn't touch, it doesn't make any contact with the surface.
And they even talk in the film how it's not emitting any radio waves, it's emitting nothing.
And what they talked about in the special features was that they also wanted to make it believable and use technology that was available. So instead of like them being beamed up, they got a forklift. No, not a forklift, scissor lift.
They got a scissor lift. My husband did bring up some good points about the scissor lift. Mm-hmm. To him, that was the most unbelievable part because there was too many people on that scissor lift for health and safety. And then on top of that, when your scissor lift is fully extended, please do not drive your scissor lift.
Yeah.
And on top of that, the scissor lift went up really far. That was a very long scissor lift.
I will also say, it's still believable, and this is the government, and when have they ever cared about people who are there? Well, they do. They care to a point. They care
to a point. The better question you should ask is, what company is building that big of a scissor lift? And isn't also selling it to us architects and engineers who definitely would put this in our building as part of something a contractor could use. Do you know how quickly and efficiently I could change light bulbs with this device?
Super quickly.
Yeah, like why isn't... Yeah, so...
Yeah.
Only downside to the entire movie, the scissor lift.
Yeah, I only say care about people's lives like in relation to like MK Ultra and they're like super secret dark black programs, which I mean that's what this is.
Yeah, this whole movie isn't attempting to create an accurate portrayal of government and people in general. It's attempting to go off of the absolute fear part.
Yeah.
But in a way that you as the audience don't immediately go, that's not realistic.
Yeah.
They're attempting to bring about all of those thoughts that creep in the back of your head at 3 a.m. without making you go, no.
Yeah, so...
Minus the scissor lift.
A little bit back to the ship itself. It makes me think of when we study architecture and we study really ancient monolithic architecture. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason I hate the show Ancient Aliens, where they're like, how could they do this? They're talking out of ignorance because they don't understand.
It's clear, people have and still do make these things. There's lots of people online who you can watch wonderful videos making these things.
People are smart enough to figure out how to stack a set of bricks together without it falling over.
And let's be real, that's a lot of bricks, and it's really tall. That's why it's impressive.
Yeah.
That's why it's still around. If it was a little stack of bricks, no one would care.
Exactly. But it just makes me think of that and like how alien the ship really is in comparison to a lot of stuff we've seen.
With the exception of Pringles. It looks like a Pringle.
No.
It does.
I don't agree with that.
I think it looks like a Pringle.
It looks like one of those damage markers from Pokemon card game.
Yeah, it does look like that too.
But I don't know. It's just such a simple and clean design.
And it's also a design that it definitely has that pebble look, but it's not so organic that you would think, oh, they're flying in a rock. Yeah. It's clearly been shaped and sculpted.
Well, and that's another thing too, is they were trying to deviate from just doing a standard cliche of a well-worn genre.
And that effort moves on to not just their ship design, but to the aliens' design as well.
The heptapods.
The heptapods. Because, granted, they do have aspects that we see in other pre-existing aliens. They are squid-esque, which...
Yeah, okay, so I want to go into this a little bit. Villeneuve said that he wanted it to be very much so, like, something he'd never seen before.
Yeah.
But immediately when I saw it, I thought of some cosmic horror from like H.P. Lovecraft.
It has very H.P. Lovecraftian vibes.
Yeah, exactly. And we really don't see that kind of stuff in sci-fi, and it gives me hope for more...
And we especially don't physically get to look at, not just once or a little snippet here or there, but like, we get to fully see these creatures in multiple angles at multiple times throughout the movie. Which is something that, with the exception of like, oh, we've created this cool monster, isn't it? Look how scary the monster is.
Yeah.
We don't normally get that level of interaction.
Well, and there's also an interesting point in the movie about halfway through when Jeremy Renner's character starts narrating over everything that's happened in what we know of, like maybe weeks or months.
Yeah, it's. I like the illusion of time on
because it really it goes into explaining what's happening without spending a whole another hour or two or half an hour to fill it out.
Could have been a long movie.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's the great thing about it is because it's one of those time jumps where it feels appropriate.
Yeah, and the way that they do the time jump isn't to the point where they're attempting for you to understand how long the time has been. You just need to know that time has passed.
And you need to know X amount of information.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like college. You have only so long to teach a specific topic.
Yeah, and how long did that semester last? No one knows.
Yeah. And so going back to the heptapods, they wanted them to have this presence.
Yes.
Kind of like a whale.
Which they achieved. Very whale/giant squiddy.
Yep. And their sound was actually one of the main heptapod vocal sound designers was David Whitehead. And if you know him,
name is familiar.
The District 9. He did the sound for those creatures as well, the prawns.
Yes.
Which
he is I so far enjoyed his work immensely. And I will say, the way they're designed is very smart, because I don't know how deep divey you get on Google at 2 a.m., but I always end up somewhere along the lines of deep ocean creatures. Okay. And one of my new favorite things to watch is people free swimming with whales. Because in my mind as a child, whales were majestic, cool, amazing creatures. And now watching people swim with them, there is a level of just pure terror because of how big and honestly, like, half the time you can't always see them properly. There's one of them. Is there more of them? I don't know.
Yeah, it's like those videos of people diving and getting attacked by sharks.
Yeah, where it's always that level of unknown, and the design of these aliens is really smart, because we're pretty like, if you weren't dialogically told there's two of them, and there's only two of them, you would have a hard time knowing how many.
Yeah.
At the beginning, it's even hard to tell how big they are. We don't even get a real sense of their scale until like almost towards the end of the
until
movie.
She enters the ship, because honestly, we only see their bottom half.
Yeah, and the camera never really knows where to pick for eyeballs, because they don't have eyeballs as far as I could find.
I mean, they have. Yeah, we don't
know.
That's the great thing about this movie is we don't. I don't feel we need to know. That's the thing.
And it's that level of detail about things you don't need to know, which helps, because like, we see them floating around in a mist.
Yeah,
it's never made clear what the mist is. It's never made clear why. Like, we don't know if like this is the equivalent of them being in space and not having gravity.
Yeah,
it's never made clear, and part of that helps so much because you don't need to know.
I will say. Before I go a little bit more into like the sound design in the movie, because the sound design is really important.
So good.
That was my one point I didn't like in the movie, is her hair.
Yeah.
In the space, and
I would have liked it more if she was grounded in the ship.
Yeah.
Only from the standpoint of that then, because my mind had already made up the concept that like, oh, gravity on Earth for them might be just really weak, and they're not used to it. Or maybe they're kind of like how we have sea creatures. Maybe to them they're floaty creatures. Yeah. And
well, I don't know. It's just the one visual thing that sits out a little bit. And that's probably my only complaint about the movie. And that's how you know how good a movie is, where it's some stupid little nitpicky
when I'm complaining about one floating hair and a scissor lift, you know the rest of the movie's pretty good.
But, so the other supervising sound designer is, Sylvian Belmar.
Mm-hmm.
And how he approached this movie is he approaches sound as a character.
Ooh.
And there was, and they were talking about in the process, sound is usually the last thing that goes into a movie.
Yeah.
And what they wanted to do to make it even more alien is normally when we think of a spaceship, we think of gears, we think of mechanical beeps and bloops going.
Very, very much Star Wars has tainted us.
Yeah, and Star Trek too.
Oh, yeah, no, the two of them have fed each other.
And so they have no artificial sounds for the heptapods. And they used actual devices over plugins to create the sounds. Ooh. So they were actually out there doing stuff. And for the vocals for the alien form, David Whitehead thought of like sacred motivation behind the sound. And so they went out, they experimented, they got recordings of native New Zealand birds, bagpipes. They made a lung out of rice paper for the breaths. And each heptapod has slightly different vocals.
Which really does help.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, the score of the movie, when the heptapods are there, the score is lighter. So that, because the heptapods' voices are so deep in bass.
Yeah.
But yeah, they did a lot of stuff. They used tape loops to create some of the sound. And that's another thing too, is they talk about the vocals as being almost, or the score as being almost feminine. It's a soft sounding soundtrack. And honestly, if we go into gender roles a little bit, the mom is the one, we've talked about, the mom is generally the one who teaches language.
Yeah.
I know that's a weird thing too, because in Germany, they don't want you teaching your kids the language. The school wants to teach it to them.
How disappointed they would be.
And that's another thing too about this movie is why having a female protagonist and a strong female protagonist, in this, and not only that, but we're also, that's another nice little thing about weaving in this movie of the daughter is we see her more and more as feminine. She's not some gung-ho action.
Well, and this is something that we don't see very often either, is we get not only a female protagonist, we get a smart female protagonist who's not presented as overly nerdy or teased for it. She's respected in her field, even by most of the military people around her. And on top of that, she's a mother. Yeah. And in her own mind, she's a mother without being the stereotypical mothering person. Even when we see flash forwards, backs to her interacting with her daughter throughout different ages, granted, she's never cold or off distance. She's always a mom. Yeah. But she clearly has other interests. She's shown studying and doing research and grading papers and having other things to do than just be a cottagecore mother.
Yeah, she's portrayed as a real person.
Yeah.
And that's
very nice.
That's the great thing about this movie, too, is everyone in it feels like a believable human being.
I would argue the only character who even remotely can be argued as slightly flat is dear Mr. Hawkeye himself. But the only reason I say that is because early on, once you learn that, these are all memory/forwards, you're supposed to know ahead of time that, Hawkeye leaves the family. Yeah. Or you think for a lot of it, well, she's already experienced someone leaving her before. Yeah. Why would he be any different?
Yeah, we already think she's gone through divorce and that the kid's already dead up until big surprise.
Exactly. And so you're not meant to see it from his eyes. Mm-hmm. And so that's the only reason why he feels remotely flat is because we honestly don't know anything about him. Yeah. Because it's not about him.
Yeah. And, just a little bit back to the score a little bit.
Yes.
I personally like this kind of score in sci-fi. It makes me feel, or some of it reminds me a little bit of Akira soundtrack.
Yeah, where it feels, every piece feels intentional.
It feels intentional, and it has that little bit of primal sound to it. Yeah. And, that's another great thing about sci-fi is when it ties back to something primitive or
something that is, you have a strong grasp on.
/ kind of take for granted, honestly.
Very true. I definitely take pebbles for granted.
Well, I was thinking language. And even, you're not on social media, at all.
Nope, I have excommunicated myself from the social media circles, I'm very happy here by myself.
Oh, yeah.
But I do rely on you and, like, my husband to inform me if anything happens.
Yeah, I still do it for, like, just to keep up with a little bit of news here and there, but, like, occasionally I'll see someone posting of, like, oh, this person said this, and it's like, well, this conversation looks like a conversation, but, like, I was actually talking to my mom a little bit about it, because she has a degree in communications.
Very helpful degree.
It is. And so we talk about communication and writing and drawing quite a bit. And when we've talked about tone.
Yeah.
And that's another great thing about this. A thing the movie doesn't actually really talk about is tone.
I would argue that it does.
Tone in writing.
I would argue that it does, but it does so in a different way. So our two main scientist characters read all of the tones throughout the movie as a learning opportunity, especially later on once they're more comfortable with the heptapods and what's going on.
Yeah.
Whereas the characters who are on edge read all of what's coming from the lessons as they're constantly waiting for that information that they so desperately want.
Yeah.
So they're looking into it, looking for that. So their tone is instantly a different tone. And then on top of that, we get to see how tone changes throughout the different nations, too. Because certain nations clearly the written or nonverbal communication that they picked came with a tone that to them, granted, and we've already talked about how they were pre-looking for things, but that tone was already set.
Mm-hmm.
And so by not having a well-established written tone, everyone was having the same problem. And so they kind of addressed it a little bit, how she was arguing that all of the scientists around the world need to be speaking together because then tone is not an issue with the writing anymore.
Yeah, and that's a big thing at the end of the movie too, is we find out that the worlds come together under one kind of organization. We don't get a whole lot about it.
We don't get a whole lot about the future.
But we know that there's some type of League of Nations or UN.
Yeah, there's some level of world peace.
Yeah, there's something that they're working towards together is the big thing. And I don't know, it's really an interesting concept because we've seen stuff like this try and happen before. The League of Nations, the United Nations, and the European Union. We have these people trying to work together towards something.
Sure.
But I think that's the biggest detrimental thing, is that we don't have a clearly defined goal.
Yeah.
Of we're just together to try and work issues out. Well, there's
a lot to unpack within that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I also started thinking about the timeline of this movie quite a bit too, after rewatching it a second time.
Mm-hmm.
Because she talks to General Chang, or is it General Chang?
I do not remember if the general was ever given a name.
He does have a name, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But I don't know, and he's translating information to her from the future to the past. And I kind of have an odd question for you on this.
Yeah.
When in the timeline does this movie take place?
That is one of the things that I like about this movie. Because you could interpret it a bunch of different ways if you wanted to. Like, I definitely know my husband interpreted this movie differently than I did.
Yeah.
Because I saw this movie and it definitely has what we understand of time up until her understanding the language. And then after that, I would argue it doesn't have a timeline. All of it is happening simultaneously on top of each other.
I will argue against that.
Yes.
Because of how the movie begins. We already have that time. We already have the timeline of the daughter dying and her narrating that she doesn't know about the beginning anymore.
I would argue that maybe both are not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever played those puzzle games where you move your screen around until you get all the dots to line up to make a picture? They're like floating and floating. It's the equivalent of looking at a really bad 3D CAD and you don't know what you're looking at till you find the right view. I would argue that that's kind of how this time is supposed to be interpreted, is it's all happening at once, but depending on where you're looking at it from, makes it either a vertical, linear, or a loop.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I this is one of those ones where I don't have an answer for it,
and I don't think you're meant to.
No, that's the brilliance of this movie and its non-linear storytelling, because
sure.
And why I want to go back and rewatch it again and again, because you just don't have that answer of where does this story end, this story begin, and like.
Well, and even the arguable actual ending of the movie, you're still left with a lot of questions, because you know the fate of the daughter and the fate of you arguably know the fate of the three main characters.
Yeah,
but you don't know the details.
Yeah, like
she explains in the movie that like, yeah, I know the outcome, but like I still don't know the bits. I still don't know the journey.
Yeah, she's not seeing everything in between, and that's like what was it? I think it's a Set Your Goals song. Life is not or something about life is not about the. Well, it's basically about the journey and not the results.
Yeah.
Whether you want to do it or not, something like that. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but yeah, I don't know. This is a really dense movie, and honestly, I'm a bit too stupid to talk about it in depth because.
And it depends on what your expertise and background is. When you watch this movie, you'll get something different out of it.
Yeah. It kind of falls under, I know it's not a surrealist movie, but it kind of falls under something like Eraserhead or Tetsuo the Iron Man.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's left up to your interpretation of what did you get out of this set of visual set of visual images that are provided to you.
Yeah. And I think that's part of why Arrival is a step above a lot of other alien movies, because it's easy to ask those questions with a super surrealist movie where you're looking at this as more of an art piece. Arrival, while arguably making those same thought-provoking points, is doing so with an alien film.
Yeah.
And at no point is it never not an alien film.
Yeah, and I don't know. There's some. I mean, I have a list of 5 questions that might as well go through them, or some of them. Like that was the big thing. Like, and even then, the movie is also about life and death of
everything.
Yeah, like even if we're gonna have a baby, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that child is going to die eventually. Hopefully after you, but. At some point, you're creating life to, in a way, creating death at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, the ever-looming presence of death is upon us all.
Yeah. And, like, how do you even bring up... And that's the other thing. They skip over a lot of the emotional parts of this movie. Of, like...
how would you deal with that, knowing that your kid's going to die early?
Yeah, and
of a terrible, painful disease.
And how do you tell your child they're going to die? Like...
Well, and clearly... At some point, she explains to the husband, like, hey, I know our kid's going to die of a terrible disease. And she already knows that that's not going to go super well.
Yeah.
But she still has to do it.
Yeah.
She's still going to do it. It's not has to. She's still going to do it.
Yeah, and that's the thing, too, is that she can't really control her reality anymore. Like,
no.
Her reality is happening. Her past, present, or her future is happening with her present at the same time.
And... one of the articles I read, some of the critics who read this saw these questions that you've had, and they also thought very similar questions, and some of them interpreted the movie as trying to explain like a Zen enlightenment sort of mindset where you just have to be at peace with all of the knowledge that you've obtained.
Yeah.
And granted, I think it was the writer... had seen these critics and was like, no, that's not what the movie is, but it still doesn't take away from the fact that that's how someone, and a lot of people saw and took away from this movie, was a visualization of that level of Buddhism.
Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's a weird thing too, because if you look at different religious scripts or even books in general, you're given fragments of a whole.
Oh, sure.
And it's about really trying to understand a complex and holistic document.
Yeah.
Or not document, just a concept. Like, going back to architecture, we see a house, but we don't think of all the little components that go into assembly and the process and
there's
all that.
Like, once you start breaking down into each single layer and component, yeah, there's a ton to unwrap there, but at the same time, you could argue that even a basic set of blueprints will get you to the end.
If you know how to read them.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then just my last kind of thought on the movie was, the movie really questions, like, if math is the universal language, because...
I would argue that it doesn't question it. I would argue that she shoots that down at the beginning of the movie.
She shoots it down, but we're still trying to base it off it, because Hawkeye's character is still trying to formulate mathematics behind it.
I would argue, yes, he is, but that's because that's how he sees the world. That's everyone has a level of language that they themselves have adapted over time, and for this character, his was math. Yeah,
and I don't know, just thinking about it, probably another good thing about, something interesting about the movie, because through most of it, between the different teams, it's a contest. It's very much an us versus them. Yeah. I think probably the biggest takeaway for me on this movie is to open up and explore and just look for things that you normally wouldn't go down.
Yeah.
Like, you and I get pushback when we try and get certain friends to watch horror movies.
Yeah.
Or certain action movies. But we have to, like, you have to find that in, because I have friends who are like, oh, I don't watch horror movies. And I'm like, well, I think I have like 5 or so that I think you would like based off other ones we've seen. And it's just taking that step, that one little step to understand something that's different and alien to you, I'd say.
I would say, yeah. I would also say that the movie does a nice job of not just making you understand that there is no them, there's always some level of commonality that you, granted with a lot of work, can get to.
Yeah.
But the movie also does a really nice job of making sure you understand that while there is no them in the sense that, like, everyone can find a commonality, there is still different experiences that you need to step back and understand.
Yeah.
Example being when she, I don't know, saves the world, I guess, with the Chinese general. She's told what his wife told him on her deathbed, which is her understanding something deeply meaningful about him that she otherwise wouldn't have understood. She would have always looked at that as a them.
Yeah.
And knowing that there's something there that she will never have to deal with, but he does.
Yeah.
And that she can be compassionate to that, I think is also a running theme throughout the movie.
Yeah, that we're all just human at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. This, I can't recommend this movie enough, honestly. Like, and I think it's been weird because in thinking of how we were going to talk about the episode, I didn't really want to go through that point by point because it's such a non-linear story, and
yeah,
I think it's better just to watch the movie.
Watch the movie, and I highly recommend watch it with someone else who's also intent on watching the movie. I wouldn't say this is like a party movie, like you really do want to try and pay attention, but you kind of want to watch it with someone else because you're going to have questions and you're going to have opinions about the movie that you don't realize someone else saw differently.
Exactly. And yeah, I don't know. It's a difficult movie to really go in depth without being...
It's a lot.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
It's a lot, and it's a lot... I would say it's arguably more of a movie than it was when it came out. But I think that makes this movie even stronger.
Yeah, I can see people showing this movie to friends and family down the road. Like, oh, you haven't seen this movie? You gotta watch this one.
Definitely.
So, Chris, do you have any last thoughts, or do you... We've already said we would recommend the movie.
Oh, yeah, no. It's highly recommend, and definitely watch it with someone you can talk to about it. I don't know. That's kind of, for the movie, that's my last thought.
This has been The Good, the Bad, and the Weird.
Thanks for listening. Happy 4th of July, everyone. Stay safe.
Eyes to the skies.
Don't blow off your fingers.
Fuck you, ancient aliens. Peace.